Hi and welcome back to the course. In this video, we're going to allow users to sign up. Now the first thing I'm going to change is this test.py file. Remember in the last video I told you that we had to run test.py from outside the folder so that data.db got created there, and then we had to run the app inside the main folder as opposed to inside code, and it was getting a bit confusing. So instead of having a sort of test.py file that creates the table, which doesn't really make sense, instead let's have a new file which is in charge of creating the required tables. I'm going to call this create tables.py, and that's going to be inside the code, so beside app, security, and user. Okay, and in here all we're going to do is make sure that we create the appropriate tables. In this video this is going to be the users table, but it might also be the items table later on. Okay, so let's import SQLite 3 and then open up the connection, which is SQLite3.connect, data.db. By the way, this data.db can be whatever you want. It doesn't have to be data.db. It can be mydatabase.db or anything else. Then the cursor, which is going to be connection.cursor. And finally, the create table query, which is going to be create table if not exists, so it doesn't exist already, the name of the table, users, and then the columns. So ID, int, username, text, password, text. Okay, then make sure to run this by executing it. And finally, we can commit and close. Okay, so now we've got the create tables script here, so we can run it and that will create a data.db, and in it, it will create the table. Now, key thing, the ID is going to start by being 1, then it's going to be 2, then it's going to be 3, then 4, and so on. When we create a new user, it doesn't really make sense that we also have to specify its ID, because it's always going to be one more than the number of users we've got in the database. Fortunately, SQL allows us to define auto-incrementing columns, which means that when we insert a row, it will automatically be ID 1, then when we insert another one, it will be ID 2, and so on. However, there is a specific thing that we have to write here, which is, instead of int, we have to use integer. And then we also have to say primary key. Now, normally in SQLite, it doesn't matter if you use int or integer, but when you want to create auto-incrementing columns, it does. You have to use the whole word integer as opposed to int. Okay? So that's what we need, really. That's everything. When we create tables, now we are going to be creating a new table with an auto-incrementing ID, which means that when we add a new user, we only have to specify the username and the password, because the ID will be assigned automatically. Okay? Okay, so now let's go back to our user file. And what we're going to do is we're going to allow our users to sign up. How do we do this? Well, we've got our class user, which gives us some power over finding users. This user class must not be the same as the resource that we're going to use to sign up. Now, what I'm going to create is a new class called user register, and this is going to be a resource, just like the item and the item list was. And it's going to be a resource just so we can add it to the API using Flask RESTful. So it's just going to make things a bit simpler. We could just create a Flask endpoint to register users. We could do that instead of creating a resource, but it doesn't really matter which way we do it. Okay, and this does mean that from Flask RESTful, we're going to need to import resource. Okay. Now, the good thing about using Flask RESTful and making this user register a resource is that we only need to do post. create the post method, and then this is what's going to get called when we post some data to the user register. Let's go over to the app and make sure that we import user from at the top here. So we're going to say from user, import user register, apologies. Make sure to import user register, which is our resource. And then go to the very bottom and do api.add resource user register. And here we can give it something like /register as an endpoint. Now what this means is that when we execute a post request to /register, that's going to call the user register, and that's going to call this post method. Okay. So what does the post method have to do? Well, the first thing it has to do is to connect. So connection is SQLite3.connect data.db, and then create a cursor, which is going to be connection.cursor, and you know all the drill with this. Now the query is going to be insert into users values, and this is important as well. And here we have to insert specific values, ID, username, and password. The ID is auto-incrementing, so we have to insert null, and then question mark for the username and password. Okay, cursor.execute the query, and now we need the username and password, which we are going to get data username, data password. We're going to get data in a moment. Finally, we're just going to commit, close, and return a wee message saying user created successfully. Okay, so the only thing that's missing is the data. But you can do this yourselves first. So I'd recommend that you pause the video, create a request parser as we did in the last section for the items. Create a request parser that accepts a username and a password, parse the JSON data coming into this post request, and call it data so that we can use it in these parameters here. It's a bit of a more complicated sort of assignment, but I would recommend that you give it a go. So pause the video now and try that, and then come back and we'll do it here. Okay, hopefully you got that. The first thing to do is to import the parser from Flask RESTful. So that's rec parse. And then we are going to create a parser in the user register class. The parser is going to be recparse.request parser. And then we're going to add two arguments, username and password. Parser add argument, the username, and the type is going to be str for string. Required is going to be true because it is required. And the help message is going to be this field cannot be blank. Okay. And then we're going to copy that, paste it in there, but call it password. Now this parser will parse through the JSON of the request and make sure that username and password are there, but we of course have to use the parser. So let's say data equals user register dot parser dot parse args. Okay, and that's it. Now what we're doing is to recap, parse the arguments using the user register parser, which is going to expect a username and a password. And then we're going to do the usual connect to the database, create a cursor, insert the values into the table with null as the ID, so it auto increments. It goes first 1, then 2, then 3, then 4, and so on. And then 2 question marks, 1 for the username and 1 for the password, remembering that username and password have to be in a tuple. So we've got a tuple here of username and password. We don't need a comma at the end of the tuple. We don't need a comma, but we can put it in if you want. If that makes you feel better that this is a tuple, you can put the comma there. It's not required. After running that query, we're going to commit, so that gets saved to the disk, and we're going to close the connection. And finally, we're going to return a message saying the user was created successfully with a return response code of 201, which as you know is created. That's what it means. Okay, so now let's save that. Make sure to delete data.db outside the project. This is not a required step, but it kind of makes sense because that's no longer in use. Let's go back to our terminal. I'm going to clear everything to make sure that we're not doing anything silly. And then we are in the section 5 folder. So we have test.py, code, and VM. We want to go inside code. So cd code. And now we're going to run create tables.py, which does nothing, but it does create the table. And then we're going to run app.py. Okay, then let's go back to Postman. And now if we type auth, we're going to get invalid credentials. That user doesn't exist because we're trying to log in with Jose ASDF, and that doesn't exist. So I'm going to close the other tabs first. So we're going to need to create a new endpoint. Let's duplicate the auth endpoint. Make sure to edit it and give it a decent name, which should be register, because that's the endpoint we've used in our resource. And change it here to be register as well. Okay. Now we can send that in. And we see the user was created successfully. And now we should be able to go to auth and log in correctly, which we do. And now we get this access token back, so we can copy that, go into post an item. I'm going to create a table. That gets created fine, and then we're going to request it, and it tells me the request token, the request does not contain an access token, which we're going to put in here. Authorization, JWT, space, paste everything in. And now we get the table back. So everything works. Once again, what we've done is we've registered a new user, then we've authorized with it, we've created a new item, and then we've retrieved the item because we know this endpoint has the JWT required decorator. Okay. So to recap the code, what we've done is first got the data from the JSON payload, then we've connected, created a cursor, inserted the values in, and then committed and closed and returned the correct message. And that is in the post method. So when we go back to our app, we see that the user register has been added as a resource under the /register endpoint, which is the one we were calling through Postman. And then when we did the get method for our item, we see that that needs a JWT, which we were passing in after authorizing. I would recommend you take a few minutes to connect all the dots in your head, maybe draw a wee diagram of how things are connecting to one another, just to make sure that everything is sort of consolidated in your head, because it's only going to get more complicated, and I wouldn't want you to feel confused. So now is the perfect time to give yourself a bit of a break and ask any questions in the course Q&A if you've got any, regarding how this works or how things connect, because I'm always available to help you out. But once you feel like you're ready, let's move on to the next video, and I'll see you there.